Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. We're going to get into a video that was sent to me on Discord, and this is kind of surrounding a lot of one of the narratives to do with the Russia invasion of Ukraine and the heightened tensions between Russia and NATO. And it's called, Did NATO Really Betray Russia? I have not seen this video, so this is brand new to me, and I'm interested in what he has to say. So let's go ahead and jump into it.
Many might be wondering, how did it come to this? How, even after the USSR fell, did Russia go down such a different path than NATO? Was there ever perhaps some possibility that these two rivals after the end of the Cold War would have came together in peace? Because apparently Putin seems to think so, or at least he says so. His current track record with the truth isn't the best, by the way.
You really think someone would do that?
Putin says Russia wanted to join NATO, but NATO didn't let them. Is there truth to this?
What do you mean,
The answer to why Russia didn't join NATO is a story about a former superpower rebuilding itself from the ground up. How Russia, or at least the Duma and Putin, viewed their status in regards to the West. So first, the question we're all asking. When it comes to this whole situation, who's to blame for this? It's Putin. 100%, this was all Putin. Even if NATO had done some bad things, even if Russia had some fair points about their expansion, even if NATO took over Ukraine, like Putin says, you still can't invade others. Like, it was bad when the US did it in Iraq. It's even worse when Putin does it now. 1991, the fall of the USSR. Russia is weak and wants assurance from the US and NATO that they wouldn't spread east of Germany. Eastern Europe could be like a neutral ground, and the United States informally agreed. Or, well, George H.W. Bush agreed. Verbally.
Bar. We can't show any weakness in front of the Russians.
This was never an actual written agreement. It was just an understanding. Oh, also I was lying. This agreement wasn't made with Russia after the fall of the USSR, but before, with Gorbachev. The importance of this agreement really depends on who you ask. For avid Russian supporters, this was a legitimate, sometimes legal agreement that NATO promised and then broke. For NATO, their promise not to move east was an informal verbal agreement that doesn't matter.
So I think this is just dependent on culture, right? This is a culture kind of driven thing where it depends on where you're from and what the area is like. Are you from a place where handshake deals are like super solid? That they are essentially a legal binding contract, or are you not? Because if you are not from a place like that, then these types of things are seen as extremely informal, I'll do what I can sort of agreements. And if you are from one of those places, then this is seen like a contract signed in blood, right? So depending on where you live and the culture of the area, it probably determines how you look at this agreement of NATO expansion. I'm sure he's going to get into it more, but even the NATO expansion itself it did not happen in the way that more pro-Russian people portray it today. After Putin's speech, the invasion of Ukraine started, you started to hear a lot of rhetoric about NATO expansion east. And I feel like it's all like true technically, but coming from a place of like not really understanding the situation, what the time was like, what the expansion actually took into account, and the reasons for it, everything like that, right? And so, again, this is a very kind of touchy subject right now with everything that's going on. But this certainly is one of the things that went into it or goes into the argument today, is the verbal agreement of NATO not to expand.
Throughout the last century, there have been multiple discussions between NATO and the Russians over their relationship with NATO. The first one, at least of note, was in 1990, where the United States agreed not to move east into East Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The USSR, though weakened, was still a prominent power, and NATO verbally agreed that they would never move in to Germany. And then the Soviets collapsed. Now, when talking about how important these promises were to the Soviets, we will never really know. Even Gorbachev flip-flops on how important these assurances actually were. What's more interesting is the constant mention of the CSCE. Never heard of it? It's because it never really panned out like it was truly planned. Whether or not any of this was true or just bluster, this talk of a united umbrella was seen as a viable possibility in the early 90s, before the USSR even fell. This is what Gorbachev and the Russians heard. Russia, at least if the Soviets fell, would be joining a united Europe. And then Clinton was elected. It's 1992, baby. The Soviets are dead. Bush, despite overseeing the fall of the Soviet Union and bombing Saddam's forces back into Iraq, still promised to not raise taxes.
Read my lip.
And then he raised taxes. So he was voted out. NATO was seen as a relic of an age that no longer existed.
I've talked about Woodrow Wilson in a lot of other videos about how I cannot stand him. Literally almost everything about him drives me nuts. Clinton is also a president that I'm not a massive fan of. There's a lot of things that go into this, NAFTA being kind of a big one, but I'm not a huge fan of Bill Clinton. And his handling of this situation, specifically right after the fall of the Soviet Union, is what a lot of, I would say a lot of, not necessarily Russians, but like people that live in the area of like the old Eastern Bloc, that academics that still give the Russians kind of like a fair shake and assume that they are acting in good faith most of the time. Most of them point back to Clinton as the reason why this starts down a bad trail.
It was an active discussion in the 90s what the fate of NATO should even be. It was a stringently anti-communist alliance that no longer had a communism to fight, and yet NATO stayed. Now, let me take out this big ol' button. I should iterate that the Russians are not simply victims in this. For Central Europe, nations like Poland, Hungary, Romania, and even other nations like the Baltic states were living under Soviet control for decades. As soon as the Warsaw Pact fell, there was a real homegrown movement to join NATO, or at least get some protection from the West in case anything happened again.
Yeah, and you can completely empathize with that viewpoint. Right? Or at least I can. You've been under the boot of the Soviets forever. And any, opportunity that was taken locally for reform or to get out from under the Soviet Union was just brutally suppressed. The Soviet Union falls, you get kind of a quote-unquote guarantee of autonomy. But if you're looking around, you're like, okay, well, the remnants of the Soviet Union are still here. So what's to say in 5 years they don't pick up the pieces and immediately kind of have a Soviet Union 2.0? So if you are one of these countries, you absolutely want at least some sort of protection in case Russia starts to climb and start eyeing its neighbors again.
Would anything happen again? Who knows? The West didn't know, the Russians didn't know, and this was kind of the basis of Clinton sort of keeping NATO around. We're into 1993. Russia is slowly rebuilding, with a few hiccups along the way. Clinton comes to Boris Yeltsin with a proposal, a partnership for peace. All of Europe now coming together. Nobody would need to expand NATO if we all were just in this partnership together. And then Clinton drops the bombshell on Yeltsin. This whole partnership.
And not only that, but the way that NATO, the US, Clinton went about the quote-unquote like reforms of Russia after the Soviet Union fell and Yeltsin gets in. The idea was that the US and NATO and I guess all of Europe wanted a democracy in Russia. But there were still a lot of hardcore communists and avid nationalists that had some sort of power in Russia, and they did not want those people to get power. Well, there's a legitimate chance that those people could get power if it's just an open democracy. So there were things that were done, things that like if Putin did them today, they would be just, I mean, he would be just raked across the coals for it. That was somewhat allowed because Yeltsin was quote unquote on our side, right? And so, you know, the US and NATO and Europe, nobody liked the communists, nobody liked the nationalists, and so it was kind of the ends justify the means. And we did the same thing with like the privatization in Russia, where it was as long as everything gets privatized in one way or another, eventually it'll all kind of, you know, it'll work itself out in the wash. But what ends up happening? What ends up happening is you essentially facilitate a system that fosters corruption, ruthlessness. You have a bunch of communists and nationalists because they held money and power already from the old Soviet system. They were able to come in and grab more money and power in this new system, kind of just changing their clothes, you know, from red to blue. And so you end up with this really weird sort of faux democracy and faux free market where it really did not have to be done that way. And so when this is where this is probably going to get a little bit controversial. But when somebody like Putin says the West, they're all hypocrites. They say that they, you know, have these principles and abide by these principles, but when push comes to shove, those principles really mean nothing. Well, when you look at something like what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union and the new, you know, quote unquote democratic and free market system that entered Russia, there were things that were facilitated and allowed to happen that just, you know, they really shouldn't have. And so I don't know. Like I said, that may be a little bit controversial, but again, just like the video has said, this is not an excuse for what Russia is doing today. But if we want to know how we got here, we have to like have a real honest look and conversation about what the West's role was in it, right? Because this very well may bring about over time the fall of this regime in Russia. And if we have learned nothing about our faults in the fall of the old Soviet Union, then we may do the exact same thing again and kind of help foster a Russia that is a thorn in the side of the West and the rest of the world and their neighbors going forward.
For peace was not an alternative to the expansion of NATO. It was a preparation for it. To which Yeltsin replied, "Why? NATO was created in Cold War times. Today it's trying to find its place in Europe. not without difficulty. It's important that this search not create new divisions, but promote European unity. We believe that the plans of expanding NATO are contrary to this logic. Why sow the seeds of distrust? After all, we're no longer adversaries. We are partners. Yet the plans continued. Poland, Hungary, and Czechia soon joined NATO. Yet this wasn't the breaking point in relations. Russia still remained a part of the NATO cooperation sphere. There was an optimistic view that the kinks in this whole thing were slowly being worked out. Now, keep in mind, this whole time, NATO is entirely justified in what they're doing. They're technically not doing anything wrong. But from the Russian mindset, going from a communist superpower to a mafia state, where this man is their leader, well, they felt nothing but shame. That fear and paranoia only began to grow, and it became manifested when this guy came to power. But even with Putin in office, and him winning the presidency through some zany means, Russia was still somewhat friendly with the US, yet that was going to change. In 2004, NATO, under Bush's push...
Yeah, I believe, if I remember correctly, I believe that Putin was the first person to call George W. Bush after 9/11 happened that was like a foreign leader. Don't quote me on that, I'm not 100%, but I believe that was the case.
Brought in 7 new nations. Now, once again, if these nations wanted to join NATO, that's fine. But after a decade of this, Russia became paranoid that NATO was simply out to get them. And then Bush welcomes in these nations as escaping an evil empire.
The door to NATO will remain open until the whole of Europe is united in freedom and in peace.
You can even go back to articles in 2004 where people say Russia is going to change their foreign policy. The Russian Duma began freaking out, and the first man they ran to was a violent Putin. Georgia was invaded 4 years later. Keep in mind when I say Russians, I don't mean all Russians. I mean the Russian government, which should usually be clear, but I just know some of you are going to try to use that as a gotcha. One question may be on your mind. After the Cold War, why didn't the Russians just join NATO if they were so afraid of it? General opposition to the West, for one. Russia, even while the USSR was collapsing, didn't want to view this as a defeat. They wanted to view this as a new age. Then it turns out only their institutions fell. But there's also another reason why Russia didn't join. NATO is not simply an alliance, it's a structured machine. When a nation joins NATO, it is not simply changing to the blue team. The way its military is organized becomes based around being able to work within that machine. A country joining NATO is a process that takes years. This isn't a process that simply happens. For one, a nation joining NATO has to be unanimously accepted by everyone. And it also has to be voted on by that nation's population. As an example, Hungary in 1997 voted 85% in favor of joining. Would the Russian people ever have accepted to join an organization that they believed was an arm of the American empire? The rule of geopolitics is the closer you are to a superpower, the more they mingle and try to control your nation. And that's what Russia really views a lot of their neighbors as, just pawns on a board for which they, as the stronger nation, have the right to control.
Yeah, but this isn't just one-sided. It's not just that Russia views its neighbors as pawns on their board. It's that they also view it the opposite way, where as NATO starts to, what they see as, encroach into places like Ukraine, they view that as a pawn on the West board, right? And so it's not just one-sided. It's that they view it as a chessboard, and every piece like closer to them that gets taken away is another now enemy piece that's closer to their king on the board. And so they view it through, both sides of that. The whole thing about it being an arm of the U.S. empire is absolutely how it is viewed. Not by all Russians across the board, but by the Russian government specifically, that is absolutely how it is viewed. And it's how it's been viewed for forever.
Their goals in Europe simply drive others away from them. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. NATO expansion closer to Russia only made them more paranoid and isolated. However, if NATO didn't expand, who's to say what countries like Estonia might find themselves in right now? It's clear Putin has some fantasy about rebuilding the Russian Empire, or at least the influence of the USSR. This video is not about two equally bad camps. NATO's greatest sin, at least in this regard, is leaving its doors wide open. It's been said that Americans should imagine what it'd be like if Canada fell to Chinese influence. Complaining that your geopolitical rival lied about letting your former allies into their compass club doesn't make you look like a victim. Nobody would feel sorry for the United States if China took Canada. They would laugh. Oh wait, actually we don't need a hypothetical. The same situation happened with the US too, with Cuba. And we know how the US would react when a neighbor turns to the enemy's side. Keep them sanctioned for decades, which, here's a little tip, is a bad thing to do too. Whataboutism is used a lot by pro-Putin supporters, bringing up every transgression the US has ever done. And it's true, the United States has done a lot of bad things.
Yeah, and so obviously I'm from the States. My opinion on this is, there are obviously things that the US has done that I don't agree with. I'm going to cover one such specific atrocity that the U.S. did in My Lai during the Vietnam War. There are lots of things that the U.S. has done that I don't agree with, right? But I don't know. Like, there's lots of stuff that China does that I don't agree with. But that's not, like, the U.S. isn't allowed to go, bomb something or do something. It's not justified because of something China does or something Russia does. Like Russia invading Ukraine. Like, okay, so what? The U.S. is justified in going to invade Mexico? Like, that just, I don't know. That's that old adage of, like, two rights don't make a wrong. Two wrongs don't make a right. That's exactly what this is. Like, the idea that past U.S. transgressions, and I'll put a link to a video down below where there is a Russian spokesperson doing a news interview saying very clearly that is true, that past U.S. transgressions absolutely justify what Russia is doing right now. Like, that is, he very, very clearly says it and very clearly believes it. I don't subscribe to that thinking.
Iraq, for instance, that was bad. It's funny it's being used as an equivalent because people in the West at the time protested the war without disappearing. The closest the US had to censoring opposition to the Iraq war was when the country industry killed off the Dixie Chick's career. Can Russians today say the same thing? Or are they not even allowed to call this a war but a military operation? That said, we should be asking some questions to ourselves. Did NATO still need to exist after the Soviets fell? Did NATO existing push Russia towards a nationalistic paranoia in its reforming years that undermined the same liberal democracy that the West was trying to plant within the country?
I'm curious what his answers are to this.
Was NATO obligated to give Russian interests the time of day? Do geopolitics even work like that? For my personal opinion, I believe that the Russians had far different expectations for what a post-Soviet world would look like. The Russians believed, in part because of those 1990 talks involving East Germany, that with the end of the Warsaw Pact, NATO wouldn't expand. That instead there would be some coalition in Europe where Russia has special privileges. While to the Americans, they took the fall of the USSR as a victory. Their promises to the Soviets were when the Warsaw Pact still existed. With the collapse, the Americans now oversaw a Central and Eastern Europe that was eager to join in the economic prosperity of the West.
And not only that, without the Soviet Soviet Union there, some of these countries and regions had problems of themselves, like where land borders were going to be and things like that. They're like, without there being anybody to oversee some of these transitions of the countries out of the Warsaw Pact, out from under the USSR, things could have gotten messy, if, at least for a little bit, in Eastern Europe. Now, I don't know. It's hard for me to say that NATO really had a purpose in the 90s, mid 90s, later 90s. You know, when I read about stuff like this, I don't know what the purpose of it is, really, right? It was an anti-communist thing. The main focus of it was on Soviet, the USSR, and the USSR fell. So if you were to ask at the time what the reason for it is, I don't know if a great one could have been given. And I sometimes wonder if some sort of other coalition could have been formed that wasn't NATO. And if maybe that would have gone over better, because NATO just had this, the Russians just had this view of what NATO was because of what it had been. And so I wonder that personally. But at a time like now, if you live anywhere near Russia, I'm sure you were going like, thank God NATO exists. Like he gave the example of Estonia earlier. I bet they are stoked that NATO hung on and still exists.
It was a complicated act balancing these nations while also trying to not exclude the Russians. A Europe that Russia claimed it wanted to be in, yet Russia only became more and more isolated. While much of this discussion is around NATO, this is simply one element. NATO, up until recent events, didn't actually move their military equipment past those original 1991 borders. The main issue the Russian government has isn't just a military bloc, but Western institutions. Or at least institutions that don't serve their interests. If Putin wasn't blaming NATO, the problem would be something else. Like, I don't know, the whole thing that started this in the first place. Like Ukrainians wanting to join the European Union. Putin's Russia really has been their own worst enemy for a while, as every hostile action, every threat, every influence, every corrupt politician has only made their former allies turn against them. It's always good to try to see from all perspectives, yet not all perspectives are equal. Sometimes the perspective is simply that another nation was a mistake to exist. Sometimes it's that the collapse of the USSR was the most catastrophic event of the 20th century. Even if there was a kernel of truth to the idea that NATO misled the Russians, it does not justify their actions. Should Putin really be talking about how misleading is bad? Kind of seems like that was their strategy for the last few months. NATO is not a perfect organization. However, if the nations of Europe want to join this club, it should always be their right. Russia expected the continent to remain a neutral ground for their own interests, even after their pact collapsed. And when that didn't happen, they claimed no fair. You do not start wars over verbal agreements that happened before most of your troops were even born. We cannot forget that this all is coming down to a real war within a split nation. A war that, while true has been raging for 8 years, only began because the Russian side didn't have their guy in charge anymore. One that escalated into an invasion of an independent nation, which regardless of the justification, only justifies the fears of Russia's enemies. So, yeah, congrats Putin. You were the monster that proved NATO was right to build up. While this alliance didn't know what it was going to be in the mid-90s, it sure does know now. You didn't want to be a part of Europe, and now you get your wish.
Okay, so that was the video, Did NATO Really Betray Russia? I would say that I feel like this was a pretty well done video. It's complicated, like most things. History is just full of complication. It's very hard to just follow one single track, pull a thread all the way through history. That's normally just not the way that it works. And so it's a complicated subject. But whether it's complicated or not does not, it does not change the fact that Ukrainian civilians are dying right now at the hands of Russian troops and bombs, and there really isn't an excuse for that. Now, I will say, in regards to something like the taking of Crimea or going into Georgia, I think in all reality, that's probably what was expected here. That the sanctions were going to be kind of slaps on the wrist. There wasn't going to be much defense put up. In fact, I think with Crimea, they more or less just kind of let them, just kind of ignored them as far as Ukraine. And I feel like Russia probably thought it was going to be very similar to that, taking Ukraine. I think they were just mistaken. The Ukrainians are very obviously willing to fight. Jesus, are they willing to fight? And the West, which is something that I would have not guessed before this happened. If you'd asked me 2 weeks ago what I thought the West response would be to a Ukrainian invasion by Russia, I would have said they would go into freak out mode, they would be bickering, but, when push came to shove, they needed Russian energy. Everybody was going to want their, cut out of sanctions, and so the sanctions were going to end up being nothing. The West was going to be completely disunified, and that was just, that was going to be what it was. The fact that the West response was unified and was as strong as it was almost as shocking to me, if not more shocking, than the Russians actually invading Ukraine. I just was not expecting it. But, again, total tip of the cap to the Ukrainians, who are just getting after it. And this was a good video. This is kind of the background and the complications into NATO and Russia. But as always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. I will put the Discord link down below if you want to continue these conversations over there. My surstroming is on the way here, so when it gets here, I'll let everybody know and kind of give everybody a timetable for that. I'll have a Sabaton history, another Sabaton song coming out in the next day or two. But yeah, with all that being said, I'll see you all next time.